everybody. Appreciate your time. Today, we're doing our next session on our podcast series related to the connected factory. Pete Cappiello, CEO of FutureTech, joined by Gary Hill. Gary, you want to say hello?
Hey, Pete, good morning. Happy New Year. Gary Hill, VP of Solution Architecture with Future Technologies.
Great. Appreciate you jumping on, Gary. If you don't mind, maybe for folks that haven't joined our podcast series, maybe a little background on yourself would provide some context to where we're providing feedback.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Pete, my career goes back a little over 35 years in manufacturing and information technology. Worked for a large company called Georgia Pacific, a large consumer goods manufacturer. Last 10 years, I spent the role as Chief Technology Officer looking at future technologies, emerging technologies, and also our Factory of the Future strategy of how you use these emerging technologies to really transform your manufacturing processes. So joined Future Tech earlier this year really to help with helping clients really bridge their vision, their strategies around factory transformation with connectivity solutions.
Great. No, we appreciate you being on the team and helping us kind of push Industry 4.0 and make it connected. So we appreciate that. But I think today our topic, we're going to talk about our transformation program framework, specifically around business case justification. So we've organized some slides on that. And just to kind of connect the dots on where we are in our podcast series, Gary, maybe you could go through some of the high level content that we've organized in our prior sessions.
Sure thing, Pete. Yeah, we had a couple podcasts really talking about Industry 4.0, kind of where the industry's heading. So I'll spend just a couple minutes with a short recap. Here's some content reviewed in one of our initial podcasts around really kind of how manufacturing and the industrial companies are really kind of going through I call the evolution, 200 years of innovation. And today we're really entering this Industry 4.0 period where we're looking at autonomous production. That's kind of the end goal. Internet of Things, pervasive connectivity, and smart factories. So, most companies are still pretty heavily in the Industry 3.0 automated production, but more and more companies are starting to look at the next wave of technologies to really take the level of productivity and automation up in their factories. One of the slides too we talked about prior is kind of where all the business benefits of this Industry 4.0 smart connected factories and really three big buckets. So again, everyone's trying to increase manufacturing productivity, increase their flexibility, obviously improve their quality, and increase their speed and flexibility to their clients. We also in the past talked about some specific use cases. We had a podcast on some deep dives of some very specific Industry 4.0 use cases that drive that value. AGVs, robotics and drones, remote expert and asset health are just some examples. So check out one of those prior podcasts if you missed those. Today, though, we're going to really focus on the question of, okay, hey, if this is the right way to go, you got all these cool use cases of technology, how does a company actually go and justify this and start down the path of making this a reality? So kind of got a framework here, really called our transformation program framework. And really, it's just a simplistic way to think about, you got all these great things you want to go do. How do you begin and how do you ensure success? And one of those ways is, I think every use case, every opportunity, you really need a business case to justify why you're making these investments. That's where we're going to focus today. But then you also have to, for most companies that are pretty large and complex, have to go pilot those technologies to ensure that, hey, the use case, the value actually is real. And then once you confirm that, how do you then go quickly scale that capability across all your operations to go maximize the value? A lot of companies, they ask you, then they get caught up in this pilot phase here sometimes, that they get stuck there and never make it to scale, so they never get the real value. And I would say also underlying all three of those kind of phases, you got program and project governance, right? In most companies, you have multiple business cases being implemented at one time. So you've got the aspect of program management of multiple things going on. Hey, each of these individually are their own projects. So I think the program and project governance running across kind of the framework is also very important. So today we're going to focus on the business case area. We'll have some future podcasts talking about these other opportunity areas as you're trying to really accelerating scale to achieve that maximum business value.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And, for us, I mean, we've 200 plus, enterprise clients in this space that we're currently servicing. They're all at different stages of their process, but, they have things that they have to resolve. But what we're hoping to do today is, provide some best practice advice for how to build the business cases, because there's difference in company size, small, medium, large, and the problems are different. But having some general framework to look at for how to justify things that you're looking to potentially move to a pilot or trial. We've seen good, we've seen bad. So hopefully, today's content helps our viewers kind of create some ideas, organize some thoughts, and based upon Gary's background and our experience, hopefully this is useful.
Absolutely. So we'll kind of dive into the business case topic, and I call it laying the foundation. We mentioned earlier you have piloting and scaling, but really, I think getting the business case pretty solid up front is extremely important. It's really laying the foundation. So really, I have this broken into like four key steps to go through. Again, many companies have kind of a business case template, but I tried to simplify this to really hit on the key points. And but really saying the foundation. If you don't get this right, though, and I've seen it happen. I've been on projects, we all have in the past, where if you don't have a great business case, you get halfway to the project, you start having issues, challenges. People start asking those fundamental questions, and if you didn't answer those in the business case, it can kind of really put a project kind of in a tailspin. So hopefully these will be of some value. We'll talk through each of these briefly, but I think the number one item and kind of a pet peeve of mine is really upfront in that business case, defining what is the opportunity, the problem you're trying to solve. So many projects get started with a new technology and often lose sight or sometimes never clearly define really what is the problem you're trying to solve or the opportunity you're after. So to me, that's the number one step there. It's also a lot of times people jump to a solution right out of the gate, and sometimes you may be right and be lucky and make a good guess. But one thing I've seen is really a key step is looking at a variety of alternative solutions in the market, right? With technology innovation happening, there's so many opportunities out there in the market. So really looking a little more broadly at what your alternatives are, and obviously then analyzing those, selecting the best, and then getting into another key aspect is really seeking management approval and commitment. Oftentimes, if your management team isn't fully committed to the venture, that can cause challenges as well. So it's really these, in my mind, are the top level key steps that really any business case really has to, I think, do a pretty good job at defining.
I definitely align on that.
Yeah, so really on back to defining the opportunity, the problem. Again, this is one that I spend a lot of time on as a CTO at a company, really helping my team, helping our business really define it. Really understand what you're trying to accomplish. The other thing too is showing a clear linkage back to your overall business vision and strategy. Hey, how is this project, this initiative, going to really link back to your overall business strategies? Why is it important to the business? I know at FutureTech, like other businesses, there are so many priorities. How do you sort through what are the most important things to get done? I think too, we touched on it earlier, but focusing on the identified your desired business outcomes and not the solutions is pretty important as you're going through defining the opportunity, the problem. A lot of people do start with the solution in mind and never clearly defined the outcomes you're looking for. I often frame that too from a business perspective of what would good look like. So if we were to do this and we were to go well and we were to go solve the problem, can you describe what that looks like in business terms? I think it's also important at this stage to start estimating a range of business value and the time frame you're going to create it. I mean, obviously at this stage you don't know the exact time frame. You don't know exactly the specific value, but I think you have to start thinking in ranges of general value and how long it's going to take to get, because otherwise it may not be worth investing in. Uh,
Well, and sometimes there's like a known problem statement that has to be corrected immediately, and you have to maybe streamline the process for that differently than something that's more of a long-term aspirational type project, and you set up your business case planning differently based upon those inputs, right?
Exactly, exactly. So, yeah, obviously, in most companies, you're probably going to have several business cases you're building. Till we think of it as you may have a high level strategic business case you're building for, hey, factory automation. It could be a high level strategic business case. Then you get into very specific solutions you're trying to solve, and those will have their own business case. So each of those is going to have a little bit different level of detail. Kind of the value that you're trying to achieve from them. It's also good as you're thinking through your opportunity problem to start identifying any high level issues or risks that need to get considered. Because in any business, any project, any program, you've always got some level of risk to deal with, either business risk or maybe some technology risk. There could be some organizational issues. So getting some of those documented and kind of on the table early on is good, because they will happen. There are going to be risk and issues. So start thinking about those early and identifying them as very important, kind of on the upfront piece of this. And so at the end of the day, really, to the output from this step is really a succinct write-up that really summarizes that opportunity problem. And again, this could be 1 page, it could be 5 pages. To me, shorter is better. But it's a really succinct write-up in business terms of really defining that opportunity problem, the value you're going to create, the general time frame, what good looks like, and then maybe any high level issues or risks that need to be kind of, put on the table at this point in time. So again, that sounds pretty simple, but you'd really be surprised how many projects or businesses for key initiatives can't give you that succinct write up that really everyone's aligned to. This is what we're trying to accomplish. So again, I think projects that start off without doing this, high chance of failure, high chance of challenges. So um, good chance to spend the time up front to get this in place and really to create that vision, for the project team of what good looks like. So a lot of good reasons for doing this well.
Yeah, 100%. That makes sense.
Yeah. Hey, and the next piece, so once you can have that problem opportunity identified and people aligned to it, then it's time to start really looking at, I'd say a variety of solutions, to solve that. And again, I don't even want to jump to technology necessarily, Pete. There's sometimes, business outcomes changes can be made with changing business processes. It's not always new technology. Many times it is. And even when you have new technology kind of injected, it typically takes business process changes as well. So when you're thinking about solutions, I challenge you to be thinking, pretty broadly here, not just with technology, but it's really, hey, how do you get the outcome? So I've got my current state. I want to move to this new future place of what good looks like. What are your different ways of getting there? And again, it starts with, hey, I think brainstorming, a variety of ways to get there. Write those down. Solve it very broadly. As you say, no idea is a bad idea at this stage of the game. I think involving team members that has a diverse knowledge and varying viewpoints is very, very important. So you get that broad perspective of how to solve the issue. Um, I always like to, when you're brainstorming, just a technique I found successful is a lot of people like to brainstorm as a group. What I find pretty helpful is brainstorming as individuals first, because it sometimes tend to, when you're brainstorming in a team environment, the louder voices tend to override people that are quieter. So I like to have a team of given that problem opportunity statement, and then having them individually brainstorm ideas and then come together as a group. I think is a pretty good technique. Again, be creative, think broadly. Um, Easier said than done, but think beyond what's obvious. Right? There's so many ways to solve problems with new technologies. Um, look at how other industries are maybe doing something. Look beyond kind of what you're doing today. I think is pretty important.
Yeah, we found that, across the different vertical markets that we're in, military is at one stage of development with certain types of technologies and solutions, utility markets at a different stage,
Mhm.
rail, manufacturing. There's a lot to be learned from like, nearby verticals, like automotive industries, very advanced on automation and autonomy in their factories. There's things that could be learned from those early adopters. And on the technology side, I mean, you're 100% right, Gary. I mean, like for us, our domain of expertise has been wireless connectivity historically. But if we just look at an in-building setting, we could do traditional Wi-Fi, we could do Wi-Fi 6, we could do Bluetooth, we could do private LTE, we could do private 5G, we could do DAS, we could do a repeater. And that's just on the wireless connectivity side. Then you have the wired side, the compute, the applications. I think like, with all these options, it's important to understand the options and then, at this stage, kind of examine them because there might be things that we're trying to solve a problem for today. But then on an overarching basis, as we understand the technology options, we might be able to solve more problems if we keep a broader spectrum of options in front of ourselves. And even on our domain, I mean, we're seeing that more and more often on projects because there's a lot of great technology that's out there, multiple vendors in each stack, and it's good to evaluate all of them, and assuming legacy vendors isn't always the best approach. There's a lot of new entrants that are providing great solutions. So I think keeping an open mind is very important.
Yeah, there's so much innovation happening in the market, with technology, in all those types of connectivity, compute applications. What wasn't possible a year ago could be possible today. So keeping the open mind and exploring. Uh, Again, thinking about both the people, process, and technology perspectives. Again, not just technology, but most solutions really are going to be a combination of these three things, right? You're going to have people, organizational changes, process changes, and new technology. So really thinking about those together is pretty important because in the end, those are going to be your solution, not just the technology. And as we mentioned, really at this stage, it's very hard to do. I mean, human nature, you want to jump to the answer and let's move on with it. But really at this stage, really don't try to analyze or eliminate anything at this point. Kind of be as open as you can. And I'll just finish up with this section saying, again, like I will say through the whole set of slides here, is stay focused on the opportunity problem that was identified. It's easy to get on a project like this to start brainstorming, and sometimes it will lead you down paths of kind of off the original problem. So I think checking and having that problem opportunity statement in front of the team is really, really important, because sometimes you through these processes of brainstorming and analyzing, you start solving other problems that maybe are good problems, but they're maybe not the problem that you started with. So staying focused on that is really, really, really key. So really, when you kind of finish this, I'd say this is a pretty iterative area of brainstorming and getting the right people involved is really, you should come out with, I'd say, a wide ranging list of alternative solutions to that opportunity problem, right? Um, Again, stay very open at this point. Again, it's really important that you get these things documented. Again, yeah, I don't think you're going to try to go for 100 solutions, but certainly something beyond one or two. So depending on the area, maybe half a dozen type potential alternatives to what you're looking at. But getting a document is important so you can share, with the rest of the team as you get to the next steps of the process here. So again, brainstorming is pretty important, involving the right team and being open. And then now we get to the next stage is once we've gone through that is really, okay, now it's time to really go through and analyze those alternatives and select the best. And again, everyone likes to jump to this piece, but earlier, but really now that we have a list of alternatives, it's time to kind of go through those, start looking at the pros, benefits, the cons and obstacles. Every solution has pros and cons, benefits, downsides. So I think it's really, really, really important to get those documented so you understand what those are. Hey, we're going to come back to risk. each of these scenarios and solutions probably has some key risk areas. And again, not just technology risk, but people, process, and technology. And certainly at this stage of the game, if there's any potential catastrophic scenarios, definitely get those on the table. I would call those showstopper type risk. Very important to get those on the list for an alternative. I think it's also important too, you're assessing the capabilities required to execute. Um, does your organization, does your team, do you have those capabilities for a particular solution? And that would be talent, skills, knowledge. That would be partners. So think broadly here, for a capability. Um, and then at this point, you can start, I think, narrowing the list to a few of the most solid and viable alternatives, right? Because this is where you typically, maybe most companies get down to, maybe three, two to three, four at the most. Kind of, you want to start narrowing the list. But again, it's based on kind of all these things we talked about earlier, the pros and cons, the risk, the capabilities required to execute. Um, and really get that down to that few, I say, the most viable alternatives. And then you can dive in and start doing, I say, that economic analysis of the top alternatives, right? Net present value. Hey, what are going to be your cost, your marginal analysis, total cost of ownership? Hey, how do you quantify the risk? And again, so you don't want to do that level of economic analysis with every alternative you started with. You really kind of want to reserve that, in my mind, to really those most viable, most solid alternatives kind of that you kind of narrowed down to. Um, Another thing we talked about earlier, but it's still important here on the economics, is you keep things, I say, ranges of outcomes, right? Um, Sometimes we try to be too precise on business cases and you get down to a specific number, when the reality is, we just don't know at this stage the exact time or the cost. So I think using the range mentality, I like to think of it is, hey, kind of what's the expected case? That's what we think is going to happen. But there's also an upside and a downside that could happen, right? So, hey, our estimates could be off and maybe it's not as profitable as we thought. That might be your downside. And then there's the upside aspect that says, hey, this might be much more profitable than what we think. So think in the terms of the ranges of those outcomes and kind of that expected upside and downside, when you're kind of documenting those estimates there.
Well, I think that's important because if you move to trialing some of these solutions, having some watermarks of possible outcomes helps you then develop the trial plan and then evaluate the results of it. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it inside of the watermarks, outside the watermarks? But having this, especially if you're going to trial a couple different options, you want to have a starting point assumption, and then as you become more educated at the trial phase, you could re-baseline that.
Yeah, exactly. And although we kind of laid this out as kind of a straight process here, I mean, this is very iterative, right? So getting these things documented, eventually you're going to have to pick and make a recommendation of what you think the best alternative is. You may get into trialing, proof of concept, piloting that, and may realize, hey, some of the benefits may not be as great. So you may want to come back to some of your other alternatives, and potentially reconsider those if possible. So again, getting this document is pretty important. Again, hitting the right level of detail. You don't want to get too detailed, but I think once you get to these ranges and cost and value, probably have someone in your finance accounting organization, I would say fairly involved at this point, helping you kind of estimate that. And then obviously you're going to have to, as a team, select the best option, based on that overall analysis. Um, so the output of this stage is really going to be really an analysis of all the alternatives, kind of a write-up of here's what we looked at, here's the pros and cons, here's how we narrowed it down, here's kind of the cost of value, and here's why we chose this alternative. So again, I would say this quite a bit of work in this section here if you do this right, really doing a deep enough dive. But this really kind of justifies your recommendation to the management team.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's important to have a few different options because I mean, again, as you move into the trial stage, the first option that you trial might not meet expectations, and then you're prepared to then look at alternatives. It's not, as you mentioned it earlier, select the low hanging preferred option and just go with it. Doing this in an iterative manner, building opinions of different options, allows you to have dexterity as you go into the next phases.
Yeah, because nothing ever goes according to plan. So,
Yeah.
having those alternatives to come back to, I think save you time in the long run. So, uh, really, the next stage after this is really I call seeking management approval and commitment. So, again, most business cases are is some formal write up. So, uh, again, right level of detail is important here. But kind of a basic outline again comes back to leading with what are you trying to solve, the problem, the opportunity. Hey, kind of how does this fit with your vision, strategy, and value to be created? Kind of a summary of the alternatives considered in the analysis, and then you get into your recommended alternative with probably quite a few details there of value, cost, risk, time frame, resources. And then I think it's also important too at the end of a report like this is to summarize really what are you asking for, right? Are you asking for funding? Are you asking for more resources? Because sometimes maybe the funding may be within the decision rights of the individual running this project. So I think it's real clear on hey, what are you actually asking for? Um, Also, we talk about pilot to scale. So I think setting expectations that on most large niches like this, we're going to do a pilot first, a proof of concept. Uh, Make sure that all our alternatives and assumptions were generally correct, and then we kind of move into that scale out phase. So again, a fairly good document that you can put in front of your business leadership team, your technology leadership team, really to get alignment around all of this, what you're doing. And then once you have that in place is really, I think, very important is, really socializing that report with the management team and the stakeholders. So, this is your perspective. You and your team to develop this, but it's important to socialize it. You're going to get a lot of questions probably. And again, you want to get the management team's review and the key stakeholders impacted. Asking for feedback, improve the recommendation because probably things that you didn't get into. Maybe you can involve everybody from the organization kind of in your business case development. So I think leaving some time for the socialization and feedback, I think is very important. Uh, I've never done a business case where there wasn't significant feedback. So anticipate that and leave time for it. And then kind of take that and then you need to finalize that recommendation and then go seek the formal management approval and commitment. And really what that looks like is typically in most organizations that probably is in writing, something formal. This goes on the organization's top priority list. You got commitment from all the stakeholders to commit resources and funding to it. So again, kind of output out of this phase will really be a decision from management on approval and commitment. Hey, to go execute what's being recommended. And again, so this can take time depending on the size of your organization. So it's obviously definitely don't underestimate the time to go through this process here. Again, we'll talk about it a bit, Pete, in the next slide around kind of just tips and guidance. But I say on all of this is, you know, the level of rigor and effort, and even the number of pages in your presentation really has to fit the scope and size of the decision you're making, right? So, for a $500,000 decision, versus a $500 million decision, the amount of rigor, level of detail you go to is probably going to be quite different. So really, use some good judgment on that as well. And here's a section two, just some guidance and tips, kind of some reminders as we talk through this. But really, I keep reiterating it over and over is you got to stay focused throughout the whole process on that opportunity being pursued. You can't let that kind of evade you. Again, I've seen many projects where you get to the end of this whole big effort and sometimes people forget or lose sight of kind of what you were originally trying to solve. So keeping that focus, I've used one pagers in the past of having that opportunity problem definition clearly documented and keeping it in front of the team. I think the other thing is, be open to challenge and changes. As we mentioned, as you start circulating this with your management team of the stakeholders, you're going to get challenges. You're going to get people that have, a different view of the opportunity problem hypothesis you put out there. So you got to be open to challenge and changes along the way. You mentioned this one too early on is just don't rush to a specific solution too early in the process. Because if you don't understand your alternatives, there's a high likelihood that you're probably not looking at the best alternative for your business. We mentioned this, but it's worth mentioning again is really through this whole process is including a diverse knowledge and set of people in the process early and often. I've seen projects where, hey, you get a small, very non-diverse team working on this whole thing, and then you kind of lay the business case on everyone at the end, and then that kind of can be pretty ugly because you didn't get those people involved early and often. Again, it may take a little more effort, it may take a little more time, but you will get them involved at some point. I recommend get it in the front end of the project. I mentioned this when we left the last slide, is really keep the information at the right level relative to the scope. Don't overwork it. We've seen some business cases that were, way overworked. Dozens and dozens of pages for a, relatively small decision. So I'd say scope it right. Don't make it any more complex than you have to. Um, and that's going to vary within your organization. But again, most groups tend to overwork these things, and try to avoid that where you can.
I think also, Gary, you raised this earlier, but, summarizing, at each point in this process, especially as you're bringing more people in from your organization, it's important to have a clear summary. What was the initial problem statement? What are the alternatives we're looking at? Providing feedback on, high level data points of the analysis that's been done, and then what are we trying to do, or what's the recommendation? But having that be summarized and then be supported with the underlying information, I think that allows, big companies are doing a lot of different things. Having that, clear summary, so when the person starts to go through the rest of the information, they have a bearing point. I think that's really important to get. If you have finance involved, IT, OT, different elements of the business, having that one anchor point for everyone to start with is really important. I think, from a decision making perspective.
Yeah, and it kind of goes without saying, we didn't say it, but I think equally important too is in most of these projects, to your point, have multiple stakeholder groups involved. Maybe your operations team, finance, your technology group, your OT operations technology. I think another key thing though is really clear on upfront is who owns this proposal, right? Um, so I think typically I've seen most success in where I've worked where really the business owns this. So although this may end up being a technology project, there's a lot of technology enablement. Keeping it a business-owned project with business sponsors, business ownership is very, very key. Unfortunately, over the years, I've seen too many projects end up becoming an IT or a technology project, where the IT organization ends up owning it, maybe not by choice, but maybe because the business thinks this is an IT thing. So think that's pretty important. Is all these should be business projects, business efforts, technologies enabler, and making sure you really know who's the owner of those benefits, who's the owner of those risks. So another thing too, I want to mention here, kind of some along the way, you also see some of these common decision-making traps, right? And we all fall into these because of bias and just kind of human nature. So these are just kind of things to keep an eye on as you're going through a business case like this and trying to justify it. But obviously, you're going to have the status quo. There are going to be some people in any organization that just resist change. And it could be at a senior level, mid level. You just got to keep an eye open for that. Because if your decision makers have a bias towards um, sometimes prolonging the status quo, so you really have to keep an eye out for that. Understand that. Hey, framing how you frame, the problem also very much influences, how decision makers look at it. So I think that's why we really emphasize having that clear definition of the opportunity, the problem, having it framed in business terms. Hey, the value is really important. Framing it correctly, right? Don't frame it as a technology project. Let's frame this as a business project. Hey, overconfidence is another, kind of thing we run into. Could be um, overestimating or underestimating, our ability to predict and estimate future events. The future's just darn hard to predict, right? No one can do it well, so we're estimating here. We sometimes tend to be overconfident in our estimates. That's why back to the conversation earlier, you need to keep this in ranges. You don't need to focus on a single number, but ranges of outcomes, because you know you're never going to get it exactly right. But overconfidence. A lot of IT teams are very with new technology, very confident that we can execute. They underestimate some of the risks. So keep a lookout for that. Another thing you run into some groups, they look at the current solution, kind of, and hey, we've already made an investment here, kind of the sunk cost theory. So some organizations really challenge with this. It's like, hey, why would we invest more? We've already invested in this area, but really, when you're trying to transform your business, you really have to kind of take the sunk cost as a past choice. You can't go change that. You really focus on the future. And then, of course, we've already mentioned this one multiple times, just using different words, but anchoring. And this is, again, human nature, relying too heavily on the first information that you received. This kind of gets back into people jumping to the solution, right? A lot of times people already have the solution picked before they clearly define the problem. So again, these are just kind of things that any organization is going to deal with. So as you're leading a project or a business case here, just things to keep in mind. And again, kind of just be upfront with these with the people on the project. So again, these are just some things I've seen from my years of experience at a large enterprise on kind of on guidance and tips as you're trying to kind of get through that business case development.
No, I think it's great information and feedback for our clients to look at, and everybody's coming from a different point and perspective, but they're all at different places on the journey to digitally transform their business, and there's personalities, there's people, there's technology, but it's a matter of weaving all those things together to find something that makes sense, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So again, today we focused on the business case, which again I call that the foundational layer. You need to really start well. And Pete, hopefully we can have some future podcast on the other topics around, hey, once I've got a business case developed, I've got my alternatives, my recommendations. Most organizations who are going to a full scale rollout, especially on something pretty big and complex, typically have a pilot or a proof of concept mentality. So I think there's some things we can share with folks how to do pilots well. And then ultimately, though, you want to get into scale as quickly as practical. So this is where you're going to get your value. And then I think too, we've got some expertise at Future Technologies to share around program and project governance, equally as important. So I think it really is all these ingredients to really to accelerate kind of your maximum business value, and look forward to some future conversations.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you taking the time to put this information together and share it. I mean, we're also here to help, our clients. We have the benefit where we have a lot of different clients in a lot of different vertical markets. We're not anchored with certain technology solutions. We're not hardware, software developers. So our goal here is just to provide some good information for people to be able to create their own framework. Maybe, one or two interesting points from each podcast is hopefully useful. But we're definitely going to engage some other members of the team to kind of broaden this series to include some of our project management folks. Point to some pilots that we've done, some of the things that have worked well, some of the things that we think that people can improve upon, and then ultimately bringing it to scale and governing that. But I think for today, I think we covered off on the business case pretty well. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact us. We have Chris York, our VP of Sales, contact information here. Also, visit with us on our website, or check out our podcast channel on YouTube, Team FutureTech. And until next time, we appreciate everything. And Gary, thanks for all the information and time today.
Yeah, Pete, thanks. Enjoyed the conversation today. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.